This is George Gruhn. We've been away from our sessions now for a couple of weeks because Christmas and New Year's both fell on a Friday, but here we are back Friday. A lot has happened since we were previously on for a question and answer session. We have a certification of election. We've had a change in majority in the Senate. We've had a bombing in Nashville that blew up a section of 2nd Avenue. We've had the mob attack on the Capitol. And one thing that has been steady throughout all of that is people still want to buy guitars. So what I can report is that Gruhn Guitars is very much still going right along with guitar sales. The guitar market seems to be remarkably resilient, and customers have not lost interest. And the pandemic, while it is raging, may soon be under control as more and more people are vaccinated. But my wife and I are scheduled to be vaccinated tomorrow morning. So I'm 75, my wife is 76, so we qualify to be in that early round. And for anybody who does qualify, I urge them to go get vaccinated. And for the rest of us, keep protecting yourselves as best you can. Wear your masks, do the social distancing, and sooner rather than later, it seems that vaccinations will be widely available. We have plenty of questions today, although for anybody who has a question they'd like to submit, please do it, because I'll be able to get to more questions if they're submitted today during this presentation. They will be put through to me, and I will respond to as many as possible. So there's still time to submit your questions. We have George Gruhn says, I got in the middle of your discussion today on Gibson electrics. I'm very interested in the Gibson electric market, as are many. Could you elaborate on where the market is today, where you see it going, and what is emerging as good investments in the 1970 through 1990 era guitars, if any? And what I would have to say on that is that when I started out in 1970, the instruments that were the most sought after were pre-World War II, Martin, Gibson, and other makers such as early Epiphones, Stromberg, D'Angelico. Those Stromberg and D'Angelico I right on up into the 1950s for Stromberg. The Stromberg died in 55 and D'Angelico died in 64. So all of those pre-CBS Fender guitars, and in general, Gibson electrics made before mid-1965. And those were the golden era instruments. That golden era hasn't changed. Those are still the golden era instruments. And those are still the ones that the vintage collectors really want. And that's not likely to change. Those are the ones that truly are the archetypes. They are the ones that were valuable then. They're the ones that bring more money today, but they're still the same guitars that I was seeking for my customers and for my personal collection in 1970. So far as what is emerging as a good investment, there are some very good new guitars. In many cases, the new ones made right now are superior to most of the guitars made in the 1970s and 1980s. There's a few pieces from the 70s that are collectible, but only a few. And some of the ones that are at the best of that period are things like the medallion model Flying V, or the medallion model Firebird. The Firebird in particular, the Firebird 5 medallion, is built very, very close in specifications to the original. And it's the reverse body, reverse peg head, old style pickups, old style tuners. And with the exception of the medallion on the front, it looks very, very, very much like the original. And there was also a limited edition of the 1954 style Les Paul Custom with the Alnico 5 rhythm pickup and the P90 bridge position pickup. That's a very good guitar, not bringing as much money as the originals from the 50s, but still a very good guitar. But there are emerging new guitars that are sure enough good, and that in many ways are more stage worthy or studio worthy than most guitars made in the 70s. I view the 1970s as a low ebb for quality in most American-made guitars, with obvious exceptions for a few custom makers such as Jimmy DeQuisto. When D'Angelico died in '64, Jimmy took over the shop, and his instruments were originally modeled very, very closely after the master, after D'Angelico. But as time went on, Jimmy came up with many of his own design concepts. He died in '95, and those instruments are great. But in general, the factory-made instruments, companies such as Martin, Gibson, Fender, their best stuff was for Fender, when Leo Fender was running the company. And that he sold out at the beginning of '65. Martin's quality went significantly down during the '70s. But today, some of the new Martins are among the finest new Martins I've ever played and that were made during my lifetime. I was born in '45. So new Martins today are very good guitars, a heck of a lot better than what was made in the 1970s or even in the '80s. For the Gibson guitars, when Ted McCarty left, beginning of '65, the quality went down. And by mid '65 is when you start seeing a really sharp decline in quality of Gibson electrics and their acoustics, but the worst are in the '70s. So far as looking for '70s and '80s guitars that are truly great investments, likely to go up dramatically, I wouldn't count on much. For Gibson, perhaps the reissue models of the V and the Explorer, the Carina models, and they made some, also the Moderne model, which is based on a drawing rather than ever having found an original Moderne, but still those have some potential. But there's remarkably few that I really consider great potential investments. person named Richard. It says, talking of collecting, curious your opinion as to why Les Paul's preferred Les Paul recording model guitars are not as collectible in today's world. Well, Les Paul himself seldom played a Les Paul that was factory standard specs. He preferred low impedance pickups, and the switch systems he liked were often quite different from the standard factory models. But starting in '69, Gibson did introduce a series, the Les Paul Personal, Les Paul Recording models that have low impedance pickups. And the body shape on the earlier ones is a bit wider than the standard Les Paul and has a more rounded cutaway. And later they made some with the low impedance pickups and the more typical same body shape as a Les Paul standard or Les Paul custom. They have never taken off really well. And today they bring significantly less money than a same year Les Paul standard or Les Paul custom. And there are only a very, very few customers I have who would want low impedance pickups on a standard solid body electric guitar. But that is what Les Paul personally liked. It is worth keeping in mind that Les Paul did not play R&B or blues, and his style of playing is not what most people use a Les Paul guitar for today. There's really not that many people left today who actually play Les Paul style music. They may know some of the same tunes, and a few people may play them similar to Les, but that few is very few. But at any rate, those guitars did not stand the test of time to be really highly sought after or collected by many people. Tony Gagliardi, at what level of humidity should my acoustic guitars be kept? Typically, we try to keep guitars at a humidity range of 40 to 50%. But I've said this before a number of times, that humidity is a function of temperature as well as how much water content is in the air. At a high temperature, the air can hold much more humidity than it can at a low temperature. And when the temperatures are below freezing outside, there is virtually no water in the air. So a 50% humidity reading at 10 degrees Fahrenheit indicates still there was virtually no water in the air, because the air is not capable of holding much water. The vapor will freeze and it'll settle as frost or whatever, but it won't be in the air. If you bring that air into your house and heat it up to 72 degrees, you have a humidity level that may be less than the middle of the Sahara Desert, and it will desiccate your guitar. It will cause wood to shrink, and if you have rigid sides on an acoustic guitar and a top that doesn't have much room to flex up or down, it's likely to crack. Now, most acoustic guitars actually have a little bit of arch to the top that does permit them to flex up and down a little bit, but there's limits, it's not much. And the point is that you need to humidify houses if you're in an area where there is central heat and cold weather outside. You need to humidify. Now, I have had a customer who mentioned that living in Colorado, the humidity tends to be very low. But he found that in rooms that were heated to 70 degrees, the humidity was particularly low, but he had a few rooms that were not heated. And the temperature was close to 40 Fahrenheit, but the humidity was close to 40%. That would actually be safer for the guitars than if he kept them at normal room temperature of 70, but with a very low humidity. 40 degrees Fahrenheit is not the ideal temperature to store guitars, but if the humidity is right, and you're in a situation where you live in Colorado or someplace like that, and you're going to be out of town for a month, if you left it in the room that's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, you're better off than keeping it in the room that's normal room temperature that you may find comfortable. Best yet would be normal room temperature, and if you have a humidifier in the room and you keep it up to 40% humidity, that's okay. Or 45% would be better yet, but then somebody has to be around to make sure that the humidifier is working and putting water in it daily, unless you have one on your central heat and air. So at any rate, central heat and air in a cold climate can most definitely result in humidification problems. In-case humidifiers can help, but even there, they need constant attention. And I've always felt that humidifying the room is better. But that is what I can say on that topic. Jeff B has a question saying, I have a question about humidifying a guitar. I have several guitars in a small room with a humidifier in the room. Despite keeping the room at about 48% humidity, I'm getting string buzz on the guitars. It is not there during summer months. I've noticed that the moisture condenses on the cold windows. If this is the case, is using a room humidifier an effective way of keeping the guitars from drying out, or is a case humidifier the only option? Well, the humidification system, if you have an accurate humidity gauge and it says the humidity in the room is 48%, that water condensing on your cold windows is not impacting the fact that your humidity in the room is 48%. If it's buzzing in the winter and not in the summer, I don't know what your humidity is in the summer, but your humidity in the summer may be higher than optimum, because high humidity does make wood swell. And that can cause the action to go up a bit. So again, without seeing your guitars, I have a difficult time giving you a definitive answer to the question. But the fact remains that 48% humidity should not be causing problems with your guitar. And condensation on the windows is an indication that the temperature outside must be very much lower than the temperature inside. So it's obviously cold out. And if you have humidity at 48% and it's really cold out, yes, you'll get condensation on the windows, but that's not, condensation on the windows is not going to hurt your guitars. Jim A. I'm always in awe of hearing of the many top performers from multiple genres who have frequented your shop over the last 50 years or so. Question is twofold. Assuming that most have a handler call in advance to arrange for a visit, who are the few notables that may have just dropped in unannounced over the years? Must be quite a shocker. Well, the fact is a lot of them do just drop in unannounced. And we have a few who may have somebody on their staff call in advance, and I'm not going to name names on that. But I can tell you that we've had lots of very well-known musicians who just simply drop in. And usually that's no problem at all. Customers in the showroom tend to be courteous. And for those who want privacy, we have 3 floors. And the 2nd floor showroom is by appointment, or at least by invitation. We have some of the higher end instruments upstairs. And typically enough, some of these people will end up upstairs with me. And there's plenty of privacy. There's no problem there. So we're able to handle it with or without any advance handler to notify us. But we try to keep our customers comfortable, regardless of who they are. And, we try to also treat people according to the golden rule. We want them to be treated as we ourselves would wish to be treated. We don't have royalty in the sense of the British system. We don't have monarchies in the USA. The fact is, not everybody has an equal amount of money. But so far as human dignity, people deserve to be treated well regardless. And we do strive to do exactly that. So he says, lastly, perhaps it gets routine to show guitars to the stars and make recommendations or on best purchases, but is there just one artist who left you just a bit starstruck as you helped them? I've handled all sorts of customers over the years. And maybe it's just part of my personality, but they're people. And I've dealt with very well-known musicians. I've dealt with some people who are billionaires, who are not musicians, and they're people. And I'm not easily starstruck. That doesn't mean I don't work very hard to please, but I have on many occasions given just as much attention to a 14 or 15-year-old player who asks intelligent questions and really is sincerely interested. And I've let them play some of the most expensive instruments from my personal collection. I enjoy teaching them if they have serious interest. But I am pleased to be able to provide fine service to well-known players and collectors, but I want to provide well-advised, good service to everybody. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm not impressed to have clientele who are world famous come in, but some of my most satisfying days do not necessarily have to have a celebrity in, and one does not have to be a celebrity to get to see our finest instruments or to talk to me. The price is the same for you as it is for them, and the quality of service is the same. We strive to give good service and to treat people according to the golden rule. Let's see, more questions. We have a person who has asked about Nick Lucas guitars. Find that question here. Jim Anderson says, I love the big body 1930s Nick Lucas Gibson guitars. Would you please speak of them? The Nick Lucas guitar is a very interesting model. It is the first model that Gibson made as an artist endorsement model with the name actually on the label. a picture of Nick Lucas holding a Nick Lucas model guitar on the label. And this model was constantly in production from 1928 to 1937, average of 5 batches a year for the first 4 years. And the full retail price was $125, which was a very high price back then. Between 1932 and 37, Gibson produced just 1 batch a year, beginning in September of 33. Gibson offered them at a reduced price of $90. And the model didn't appear in the catalogs after 37, but they continued to ship some that's basically new old stock that had been sitting there through 1941. And they probably made close to about 300 of these guitars. But the ones from 26 through 27 are pre-production, basically prototype models. By 28 and 29, they were a standard catalog model, but they were still 13.5-inch body width, which is also what the 26 and 27 models were. And they were a sort of A-brace pattern. It was almost like an arch top guitar, parallel top bracing, or at least angled, but not totally true parallel, but not X-braced. But by 1930, it's when they switched to the 14.75-inch wide body and the LOO body shape with X bracing. They were still mahogany back and sides, 12 frets clear of the body. 31 and 32, they were still 14.75 inches, but they had a 13 fret neck with an elevated fingerboard and a pick guard that was elevated like on an arch top guitar. And they had a bridge similar to an arch top guitar, movable, adjustable height bridge that was not glued onto the top. And typically those are Brazilian rosewood back and sides, but by 33 and 34, they had a still 14.75-inch wide body, X-braced, and they had East Indian rosewood back and sides, 14 fret neck and a standard bridge. Those are some of the best of all the Lucas guitars. They're great. And 35 through 41, they had them similar specs, but with curly maple back and sides. They've done a number of reissues. They did a reissue from 91 and 92. It's just 100 of them. And then they did another reissue in the smaller body one in 93 and 94. So the Lucas model has gone through a lot of changes over the years. And so they're quite an interesting guitar. If you'd like to discuss it further, you can always call the shop number and ask for me, or just email me, george@guitars.com, and I'll be happy to respond. Scott R. says, I played with a steel bar will a vintage round neck Dobro set up with a nut extension sound similar to a square neck Dobro from the same era? National Guitars warns against using a round neck long-term in this type setup, and I see almost every round neck Dobro from the 1930s advertised as Hawaiian setup. Obviously, string gauge would play a role. Well, the answer to why you see those 1930s wood body Dobros advertised as being a Hawaiian setup is twofold. One, frankly, the best sounding round neck resonator pre-World War II guitars are metal body Nationals with an upright cone, or the tricone models. They also did some round necks of those, metal body National. But the wood body Dobros with a round neck typically really didn't sound very good. And the basic demand for Dobros with a wood body and the standard Dobro resonator system with a spider bridge is from players who play Hawaiian style. The other factor is that the neck construction on those old wood body Dobros was pretty funky. And the neck angle over the years tends to shift a bit, and the necks tended to warp, and they didn't have an adjustable rod, and they simply don't play well as a round neck. But if you put a conversion nut on it, it works just fine for Hawaiian. Oswald, Pete Kirby, by the name of Oswald, played with Roy Acuff for many, many years. Right up until near the time of his death, played on a round neck dobro with a conversion nut, and it sounded just fine. So typically when most dealers, Gruhn guitars included, as a pre-World War II wood body dobro, round neck with a warped neck, we just put a conversion nut on it and sell it Hawaiian setup, because bluegrass players are perfectly happy with that setup. And it's not cost effective to try to set it up as a standard round neck. And quite frankly, they don't sound very good as a round neck if you do take all the trouble to set them up. Another interesting commentary on that is Paul Beard, who makes what I consider to be some of the absolute finest resonator guitars ever built, and they're made right now in Hagerstown, Maryland, makes good sounding round neck, standard guitar playing style, wood body guitars with the same resonator system as the Dobros had, but Paul Beard makes his own resonators, his own cover plates, and his own spider bridges. He makes the metal hardware, and his work is impeccable, and his instruments sound great. But at any rate, that is why you see those round neck guitars being advertised as set up Hawaiian style. Karsten asks, when did Washburn guitars start using steel strings? Can you discuss their quality compared to other contemporary makers? Well, Washburn was a branded name of Lyon and Healy. And those made by Lyon and Healy were up through 1927 and 1928. Lyon and Healy sold their factory, and basically Washburn brand continued to be made, but not by Lyon and Healy anymore. And the Lyon and Healy made Washburns were designed for gut strings. But the ones made after that, to a large extent, W.R. Stewart Company made them. And actually there were some that CMI ordered that were Washburn brand with some Gibson components, or even made by Gibson in some cases. There were a variety of things that CMI had things where, owning several companies, Chicago Musical Instrument Company, they could have Gibson do some component parts and others do more. So instruments could be sort of a composite, but those were designed for steel. So after from 1928 onward, the majority of Washburn brand guitars were designed for steel strings, and current Washburns, post-World War II Washburns, again, the name keeps changing ownership. So Washburn instruments today are Asian imports, and some of them are modeled after guitars made during the 30s by a variety of makers, including Regal in Chicago. But again, if you talk about the earliest Washburns, those were all designed for gut. And he has a question, same person, Carson, says, I have a 1964 SG Special that is refinished with clear polyurethane. It feels heavy compared to another 1963 original SG Junior that I have. I would like to refinish in nitro. Will a nitro finish lower the weight or should I get a professional to sand my current poly finish? The weight of the finish on a guitar, whether it's poly or nitro, is absolutely minuscule. You're not going to change the weight of the guitar noticeably, whether you refinish it or not. You may change the tone, but if you feel one guitar weighs significantly more than the other, that's not going to change. Now, two pieces of mahogany can differ greatly in density. It is not like a synthetic material where you just whip together a big batch and it's all the same. Depending on growing conditions, soil conditions, mineral content in the soil, it can drastically impact the weight of the wood. And secondary growth wood tends to be lighter weight. It grew faster if it's got more light than something grown in a virgin forest, which tends to be a bit denser. So two pieces of wood of the same dimension and the same species can differ by 25% or even more in weight. But refinishing your guitar is not going to change the weight. It may sound a little better with Nitro Finish, but again, I wouldn't count on it being dramatically different on a solid body guitar. We have a customer, Mike M. I recently purchased a Morris Tornado GZ Style G guitar, Japanese made, 1980. I was told the electronics seemed extremely formidable as well as beauty of acoustic sound. Well, he sent a number of photos, and I'll hold up two photos here. You can see. There's one. Anyway, Morris Morididagaki factory was in Matsumoto, Japan. I actually visited the factory in 1974. I was in Japan for a couple of weeks. This particular model has a bowl back similar to and almost certainly inspired by Ovation, mahogany neck. This model was imported from Mortadida from 1970s on into the 1990s and again in the early 2000s. Typically when we see them on the market, which we don't see a whole lot of, and it's not the kind of thing we normally deal in, but we've seen them listed in the range of $400 to $450. Morris Company did make good guitars. And if anything, they make even better guitars today because the cost of making a guitar in Japan today is every bit as high, if not higher, than in the United States. Even in the 1970s, the cost of real estate in Japan was typically more per square meter than in the US. And the cost of fuel was more. The cost of raw materials was every bit as much or more. There were some forests in Japan, but they're national treasures that they don't cut. They cut wood from other people's countries. So they import wood. And Japan is volcanic islands. There's no limestone. There's no iron ore. There's no coal. There's no natural gas. So gasoline, all fuels cost more there. So wages in the 1970s into the 80s were lower in Japan than in the US, but not anymore. And the wages that workers make working at Martin, Gibson, or Fender are not especially any higher than the wages paid in Japan. So today, most of the guitars made in Japan are actually made for the domestic market, and they have to be good in order to compete. So the quality of workmanship on many Japanese guitars today is fully equivalent to guitars made in the USA. and some now with Japanese brand names that are imported into the USA are actually Japanese management of factories that may be producing guitars in China or Indonesia. So guitars that are truly made in Japan these days tend to be quite expensive and typically very good quality. Okay. Thomas Van Tilburg asks, what year would you consider to be the best for D'Acquisto guitars? Well, I mentioned earlier that he took over D'Angelico's shop. He was D'Angelico's apprentice. And when D'Angelico died in '64, Jimmy took over. And he worked it till he died in 1995. Interestingly enough, D'Angelico died at age 59 of a heart attack, and Jimmy died at age 59 of an epileptic seizure. But Jimmy didn't make as many guitars as D'Angelico, but his guitars were of supremely good quality. Typically, for an individual, independent luthier, their best instruments are likely to be their newest ones. They have more years of experience, and as long as they're not suffering burnout or dementia or such severe arthritis that they can't work, there's no reason to suppose that their newest should not be the best. They are the best. The more years of experience they have, the more they know how to do it. So certainly his most innovative designs are some of his latest. And so that means guitars made right at the time he died, 1995, tend to bring the highest prices, but they're also the most avant-garde, rather quirky instruments. But he was certainly regarded, and rightfully so, as one of the finest builders of archtop acoustic guitars in the history of the instrument. And all of his guitars are greatly sought after, but they're all really good instruments. There's no year for him that they're bad. They're all great. But some of the most interesting ones are the latest ones. Same person, Tom Van Tilburg, says, I agree with you that Adirondack spruce is a superior wood for guitar tops. I'm curious as to whether anyone makes a hollow body or semi-hollow body guitar entirely of Adirondack spruce, except the fretboard, of course, which would prefer to be ebony. And the answer is none that I know of. And I certainly would not consider spruce to be a good wood for a guitar neck. It wouldn't be strong enough. And for back and sides, spruce is just really not the ideal wood. Spruce is a great wood to be the vibrating sound producing component on an acoustic guitar, and backs and sides have a different function. Sides are primarily structural to hold the guitar together and to be rigid, and the backs are a reflector. And the back and sides certainly do influence tone. In fact, the wood on the neck does as well. But an entirely spruce guitar is not something that most makers would even attempt to do. I have seen a fully spruce flamenco style guitar made in Japan, and frankly, it did not impress me as being a notably good instrument. But and Adirondack spruce, as much as I really think it's a great wood for acoustic steel string guitars, most classical makers prefer European spruce, which is a bit softer, but it does work great on nylon strung guitars. I think Adirondack would as well, but not too many of the classical makers have used it. And you can make wonderful sounding steel string guitars with a variety of top wood. So it's not that Adirondack is the only good. It happens to be my personal favorite. It has real crisp clarity and great dynamic range. I like it. But I would say that Carpathian spruce, Alpine spruce are really great. I've heard some fine guitars with Sitka spruce tops and also with cedar tops. And there's a variety of species of cedar as well, and then redwood as well. But still, everything that comes around as far as what do I personally prefer, Adirondack spruce. But that's a personal preference. There's some fine players who find that they are quite happy with some of the other woods. I can assure you that Adirondack spruce, as well as Carpathian spruce and Alpine spruce, are phenomenal wood. And there are still some really good guitars made with other wood. So I don't want to say that only one wood is great, but that still is my favorite. Kevin asks, what's the best way of attaching a strap to a vintage Gibson A model mandolin? Some say that a strap pin should never be installed into the neck heel because drilling a hole can compromise the heel and cause it to split. Others say attaching the strap to the headstock puts a lateral strain on the neck heel, which can lead to a neck reset. What is your advice? The amount of tension on a mandolin with 8 strings tuned as high as it is an enormous amount of tension. Whatever pressure there is from putting a strap at the peg head is minuscule compared to the amount of tension that you'd get from the strings. So putting a strap on the peg head is no problem. Putting a screw and a strap button on the heel of the neck, if it's done properly, is not likely to cause the neck to crack. But you need to drill a guide hole, and it's best to have that done by somebody who knows where to put it and how to install it. If you don't drill a guide hole and you just think you're going to screw that screw into the neck, yes, you have a high probability of cracking the neck doing that. But since a lot of mandolin players do play right on up pretty well to the end of the fingerboard, that strap button on the heel of the neck is a bit in the way. On an F model mandolin with a curlicue scroll, the standard is to just put the strap through the scroll, and the scroll is decorative carving. It's really pretty, but it's also a real expensive strap holder, but it works real well for that. There's no problem figuring out how to put a strap on an F model mandolin with a curlicue scroll. But the other fact is, it's very good players play on A model mandolins and just hold them very much the way a ukulele player would, and they don't need a strap at all. I don't have any trouble playing a mandolin without a strap. But on the other hand, I'm not really a professional mandolinist, so I'll not give much advice on how to play mandolin the way I do, since I've never made any money playing mandolin. He also asks, can the bass frequencies of a mandolin or guitar increase so the instrument has more bass, a deeper, throatier sound or growl? Can the bridge and or strings produce bassier sound? I've tried Breckley bridge, which I'm not familiar with. It seemed to deaden the sound. I've tried a Red Henry one-piece bridge. It seemed to produce good balanced overall tone, but I'd like more bass. I know from experience that elixir strings tend to sound bright with more treble. Is there a string brand or type which produces a darker, bassier growl? Mandolins are tuned like a violin, and the ones that tend to have the most bass response tend to be instruments built like an F5 with a elevated fingerboard and a bridge that's centered on the fingerboard, which the A models are not, and in fact, none of the oval hole models are. and trying to get a deep, throaty growl sound, or that bark that bluegrass players like when they are playing those chopped chords on a round hole mandolins. It just ain't gonna happen. And you might as well get used to the fact that they should be set up to produce the best sound that that instrument is capable of, rather than trying to make it sound like something that it isn't. So if you want to set it up to be optimum sound, the great way to think of it is try to find out what is the best sound that instrument is capable of and set it up to enhance that, rather than trying to make it sound like something that it's not. That's going to be true of all instruments. These instruments don't all happen to be designed for the same sound. Find out what is the optimum sound that best suits that type instrument. Set it up accordingly to do that. And if you want a different type of sound, you need a different instrument. Same person asks which material is better for the nut, traditional bone or mother of pearl. Would the latter produce a brighter or even shrill tone? Well, the original F5 mandolins and a lot of the F4 mandolins have mother of pearl nuts. And it's worth keeping in mind that the only place where the nut is going to have any impact at all on the tone is on the open strings. Bone and mother of pearl both produce perfectly fine sound, and the difference in tone is going to be barely discernible and not at all discernible for any of the fretted notes. His fourth question is, what American non-bowlback mandolin would you recommend for classical music, the A or the F style, F hole or oval hole, and why? Well, for Gibson mandolins, the A and the F styles, if they're oval holes, sound remarkably similar. The scroll is semi-solid, and the points on the body are filled in solid. They don't produce tone. And the oval hole models for the F models with the curlicue scroll or the A models have exactly the same scale length and exactly the same number of frets clear of the body. They both work fine for classical. They were designed originally for classical. They weren't designed for country music, especially models like the F5, which was $250 new in 1923. Hillbilly players didn't have $250 plus about 40 more for the case. That was a year's income for most of them. Back in 1923, a Model T Ford cost $265, and the F5 cost $250. And by the time you added the case, the F5 with case cost more than a new Model T Ford. They were designed for classical players, and those are good. Old F5 mandolin is a wonderful classical mandolin, but you can do great classical on an oval hole too. And also Lyon and Healy made some fine carved mandolins. The scroll headstock Lyon and Healy style A mandolin is one that is a favorite among many classical players. Again, one last question from the same person. What is a Vierzy tone producer? How does it work? Why didn't it catch on in the production of mandolins over the past century? Can it be retro installed? The Vierzy tone producer was a circular disc with two little F holes cut in it, made of spruce, and it was suspended from the top braces on F5 mandolins, mostly in 1924. It was an optional feature. It cost $15 extra, and $15 in 1924 was a lot of money. There's plenty of guitars that cost no little more than that, and some that cost less. It was supposed to sort of even out the response and give you a more even response and make a more singing treble tone, which suited classical players. And the fact is, I've heard some models with the Vierzy that sound really, really good for classical, but they don't generally produce that real chopped chord sound that a lot of bluegrass players like. It didn't catch on with bluegrass people. the F5 mandolin really wasn't used much in country music prior to Bill Monroe. And Bill Monroe was playing on the 1923 mandolin, which he bought in the early 40s as a used instrument. Bluegrassers wanted that Monroe type sound, those chopped chords, which is not a classical style sound. It also has a more bassy sound. The F5 is capable of more bass than most of the earlier mandolins because it also has a larger soundboard that vibrates because of the elevated fingerboard on the top. And also the parallel tone bars gives a larger area of vibrating soundboard. But at any rate, why did the Viersy not catch on? One, it was expensive. It had been endorsed by Lloyd Loar. Lloyd left at the end of 24. He's the one who convinced the people at Gibson to use Viersys. And when he was gone, Gibson no longer ordered more Viersys, and they no longer made very many F5 mandolins. But there were some Viersys also installed in guitars. My personal L5 guitar made in 24 has a Viersy, and that guitar is one of the finest sounding L5s. In fact, I would go as far as to say it is the finest sounding L5 I've ever owned or ever played. I like it better than any other archtop guitar I've ever played, but that doesn't mean everybody else feels the same. And there are hardly any people today who request a Viersy. It's not easily retrofitted into an instrument. You'd have to take the back off to install it, and that's not advisable. I've heard a few new instruments made with a Viersy, and in general, they don't suit what most players today want. Jack D'Amico asks, what is your opinion of Standell guitars? Their amps are collectible, but what about their guitars? Well, Standell guitars were, at least some of the models, designed by Kuntz, who was a good archtop builder. But for the most part, they are electric guitars, mostly laminated construction, somewhat similar in design to an ES335 Gibson. They are not highly sought after, and I do not regard them as either highly collectible or highly desirable. They're okay utility tools, and I'll leave it at that. Roger of Whiteway asks, how would you describe the difference in sound between a Martin D28 and a D35? The D35 came out in '64, has a 3-piece back. The D28 has a 2-piece back. They're both rosewood. The bracing on the D35 is slightly lighter, which does, at least in the ear of some players, seem to produce a somewhat more lively sound. But I find that in general, we do better with D28s as far as resale. But Dan Fogelberg liked D35s, and they're quite similar in sound. But there is slightly lighter bracing on the top of a D35 than versus the same year model D28. Scott Shapiro, what is your opinion on pre-CBS Fender Jaguars as investments and overall quality? Well, so far as overall quality, when it first came out in '61, the Jaguar was the most expensive model in the Fender catalog. The quality, obviously, as far as workmanship, was as good as any Fender guitar. But do more people today like Jaguars versus Telecasters or Stratocasters or Jazzmasters? The answer is no. The Jaguar had a shorter 24-inch scale, and the others, Tele Strats and Jazz Masters, have a 25.5-inch scale. Most players prefer the longer scale on the Fender. Majority of players don't especially care for the switch system or the tremolo system or the bridge design on either Jazz Masters or pre-CBS Jaguars. And on the new models that Fender makes that are Jazz Master and Jaguar style, they have a better design bridge and tremolo that stays in tune better. But so far as investment potential, investment by its very nature means, do you expect it to rapidly escalate in value? It's not a matter of how much do you like it or what is the quality, but are you buying it as an investment or a guitar to play? If you like playing Jaguars, more power to you. It's not my favorite model by any means. I think that I'd much rather play a Jaguar, but for that matter, a Jazz Master, excuse me. I'd rather play a Jazz Master than a Jaguar, but I'd rather play a Tele or a Strat than either one of those. If I was going to play a Fender, I'd be playing a Fender Strat or an old Blackguard Telecaster if I were going to play a Fender. But what I want to play and what you want to play may not be the same. But so far as which ones bring the most money, it still is pre-CBS Teles and Strats. Do I expect Jaguars to rapidly escalate in value? No. Are they bringing more money today than they did 20 years ago? Yes. But so far as investment potential right now, it's unclear what you can buy that's going to necessarily rapidly escalate in value. Many of these guitars are selling now for about the same price that they did 15 years ago. There was, after all, a bubble in the market from 2002 through late 2006, extending into early 07. But by mid 07, prices were stagnating, and in 08, they started to crash. And many of the prices now are right about where they were. They've sort of gotten back to where they were at the height of the bubble, although some are below it still, like Les Paul Juniors, Les Paul TV models, and even gold top Les Paul guitars with P90 pickups. They had the 56 gold top with P90 pickups in late 06 would bring as much as $80,000. They're not up to that yet. They crashed, went down to about 35. And they haven't gotten anywhere near 80 yet. I don't know if and when they will, but there's three types of buyers. There's utility tool users, there's true collectors, and those people buy them to keep. But the utility tool users have a limit to how much they're willing to pay. They just want utilitarian appeal. They're not interested in super collectability. Collectors are not buying them to dump them quick. They may sell them someday, but typically if it's selling, it sells when they're either senile and the family is moving out some of the stuff, or when they die and the estate executor is moving it. The collectors buy them to keep. But speculators can bid prices higher during a bubble. All they see is that the price is here. It's been doing that. They anticipate that. And that anticipation could be wrong. If the price gets bid up to where the only people buying are speculators, which I as a dealer can tell pretty quick. I know when I talk to a customer which category they are in the first 30 seconds to a minute. They ask different questions. But if the only buyers beyond price X are speculators, that market's not going to last much longer. It will crash. But anyway, prices on many good electrics now are about where they were 15 years ago on many of them. And on some, they're less. But on most, they have pretty well fully recovered, but not all. I gave a couple of examples of some that didn't. Michael James asked, I'm happy owner of 2 Martin Sinker models from you, wondering what 21 might bring on this front. Well, we are in the year 2021. And we do have a variety of rosewood models that will be coming with my design work. And we also expect to be receiving this year Sinker 12 fret slot head mahogany, Sinker mahogany D models. So that's something that will be new this year. So the models that we have been offering in Sinker mahogany will continue to be made. And there will be some new additions to the line, rosewood and the 12 fret slot head mahogany, Sinker mahogany D. Marshall Cohen says, just curious about your reaction to the news that Reverb, the online marketplace company, is stopping and I assume going out of business. Can you comment on this? It's news to me. I haven't heard that. So I'll check, but somehow I have great doubts about that. And oh, Sarah on my shop here has checked. They're not shutting down. Reverb Sites, a service that allows sellers to create their own website, will be shutting down on April 30, 2021. But that doesn't mean that Reverb as a company is shutting down. You will still be able to buy and sell on Reverb. So that's the answer to that question. Stefan says, so far as I know, Martin built very few solid peg head 000 12 fret guitars, the majority being slotted. I'm curious to know if the break angle at the nut has anything to do with that. Well, the break angle at the nut would be different, as on any 12 fret guitar. If you have a slotted peg head, it actually makes no difference whether it's 12 fret or 14 fret. If you have a slotted peg head, the strings essentially are recessed halfway through the neck, through the peg head. So therefore you have a sharper break angle over the nut. There were a few 12 fret solid peg head 000 12 fret Martins made in 33. They're extremely rare. There were also a few 12 fret solid peg head D models made at that same time, and a very few D, also 12 fret solid peg head made in early 34. So early 34, you could get a 000 or a D with a solid peg head and a 12 fret neck, but they're exceedingly scarce. They're great guitars, regardless of whether they're solid peg head or slotted peg head. They would be highly collectible either way, and they would be fine sounding either way, but they will sound a little bit different. William asks, you've spoken at length about the difference between pre-war versus post-war Martin and Gibson flat top guitars. What about pre-war versus post-war arch tops? I'd be interested in your opinion on higher end factory production acoustic arch tops, such as the pre-war Gibson L5, Super 400, and post-war L5 and Super 400. In general, I prefer the pre-war models. They're acoustically, at least to my ear, more vibrantly alive, and they really do suit me. But part of the difference in tone between the pre-war L5 and Super 400 versus the post-wars, most of the pre-war models are non-cutaway body. The cutaway Gibsons were first premiered in 1939. They offered the premier model cutaway Super 400 and L5. And post-war, they made a few L5 and Super 400s non-cutaway, but the majority were cutaway. And pre-war, for the most part, what Gibson was producing in archtop guitars were designed for the big band orchestral rhythm sound. And this was for people playing acoustically with no microphone in a band where they were not playing lead, they were playing chord rhythm, and they needed to play loud where they were going to be heard in a band that might have horns, drums, piano, and they sure enough needed to be loud, whereas post-war, they were typically cutaway, and they were made for jazz players who wanted to play smooth, mellow jazz. And they were playing lead, often with a microphone or a floating pickup, and they were not aiming for the same type of sound. So they were shooting for a different goal. And they are different. If you're interested in a mellow jazz cutaway guitar, the early 50s into the early 60s L5s and Super 400s are quite good. And that's, you know, like if you think that Johnny Smith was a wonderful player, and he was playing, originally he was using a D'Angelico archtop with a floating DeArmond pickup, and later in 1961, Gibson convinced him to endorse their model, and they did a model that was actually very much similar to his D'Angelico with X bracing and the slightly shorter scale, a 25-inch rather than 25 and a half, and a fairly thick top that was suitable for putting a pickup on. And that's the kind of thing that if you're shooting for different goals and they sound different, so be it. The 50s Gibson archtop cutaway guitars, Super 400, L5, and even the L7 cutaway, they're good. They're good for what they were designed to be. Anyway, we've had a good session today. I'll look forward to next week. And we'll hope that next week overall, at least so far as the political turmoil may quiet down a bit, we all could use a bit more tranquility. And take care of yourselves. For those of you who qualify, go get your COVID shot. My wife and I will get ours tomorrow morning. And for everybody else, take care. Have a good one.